Hey guys, it's Dave. Well, we got the debt ceiling limit extended just like we knew they would this week before we ran out of money in a bipartisan negotiated deal. They actually accomplished quite a few things in this bill. Obviously, the debt ceiling has been lifted, but they actually made it for the next 2 years where we have no cap for real on God. No cap to the debt ceiling, and that goes through 2025. A couple other things that it does is that it avoids obviously defaulting now that we can run our negative balance up higher than the $32 trillion limit or whatever it was, 31.7 and some change. What's a couple hundred billion amongst friends? So obviously we're not going to default. The stock market is going up crazy today. Today is Friday that I'm filming this video. But there's a couple of things that I have concerns with on this because it sets a precedent that I think is a little bit dangerous. What could go wrong by giving the government absolutely no cap on how much debt they can go into? They're always so trustworthy in how they spend money. I'll show you a chart here in a little bit that shows that they don't really know how to balance a budget. But one of the things that the Republicans were celebrating was that they negotiated a limit on spending, so like to 1% next year and tied to GDP and stuff. But if you look at where our spending is since we've hit the pandemic, you'll see that we're in really dangerous territory. But before I get into that, one thing that this also does is moves the repayment of student loans is now off the table in terms of negotiating any future extensions of that. And we have $1.6 trillion. That's this part in the red, $1.6 trillion of student loans that are now coming due here by the end of the summer. That is seen to be super deflationary. The average student loan payment I saw a stat was $393. So there's a lot of people, I think it's 40 million Americans are going to have their student loans started. And the average of that is almost a $400 payment getting added to everyone's monthly budget. So we'll see what that does for overall inflation. I have a feeling we're going to see some defaulting. We're going to see a lot more stress on homeowners. Instead of banking that $400 and paying off other debt, we have been just growing. You see all of these numbers going up. During the pandemic, the amount of debt we've had, we hit 1 trillion in credit card debt, 1.6 trillion in student loans, 1 trillion in 1.6 trillion in auto loans. All of those balances going up, all the while not having to pay student loans. That should put pressure on the economy to bring inflation down. We'll see how that goes. But that one is interesting. And the other thing that needs to be pointed out in this is the level of spending that they're supposedly putting a cap on has grown tremendously since the pandemic hit. The red line here is outlays. This is how much the government is spending, and the blue line is how much they're receiving. This chart goes way, way back. And we really only have a period of about 4 years in the late 90s where we actually took in more in taxes than we spent as a government. I also found, looking closer, like 1 year in 1969 and 1 year in like 1960. We've had like 6 years in 100 years where we actually don't spend more than we take in. But you'll see this big spike here. This has actually happened in 2020. And that's obviously the COVID stimulus. We went from averaging about a 3 to 4 trillion, 3 to 4 trillion in expenses for the federal government. And we bumped right through 6 trillion with all the stimulus and stuff like that. And we've said now that we're celebrating that we're capping the limit on what the government is going to be spending, but we're capping it we're limiting it at a way high number, 6 trillion. And if you project it going forward, they're projecting even as high as 8 trillion in future. I'll show you. Let me pull this up because I have this number in like numerical form. You can see here, this is like the chart. This is straight from the White House, and column C is the amount of expenses. Here's the year, and then here's the income. This is how I made that chart that I just showed you. But you could see here we went from like 4.4 in 2019, and then we go 6.5 trillion. That's a 47% jump in 1 year, and we're not really looking back. We're just gonna stay at the 6 trillion mark and then even go up from there. So yeah, they're kind of celebrating, you know, that the next 2 years we're gonna only increase our spending by 1%. But it needs to go back down to the 4 trillion mark before the pandemic. We don't have a pandemic anymore. We don't need the stimulus anymore. We need to avoid having to eliminate our debt ceiling and, you know, have all of this crazy spending and debt running up at high interest rate costs. So that's kind of my little speech on this. I want to just show it to you again. We spike way up, and now we're kind of saying, look, for the next 2 years, we're not going to spend more than $6 trillion, which is more than we've ever spent in the history of our country on a yearly basis, except when we were in a pandemic. Well, if we're not in a pandemic that officially ended by executive order in April, then I feel like we need to rein in the spending a little bit and get inflation under control. So that's kind of where I'm at with it on the debt ceiling. I'm glad that we're not going to default. I think that, you know, everybody seems to be happy it was a bipartisan negotiated thing. The stock market's rallying. We'll see what giving them unlimited access to as much debt as they want to run into and spending $6 trillion per year when they're going to bring in only $5 trillion in income. They're either going to have to raise taxes in order to make up the difference, because they certainly don't want to cut spending, it looks like. So we'll just continue to run up the debt with no limit, no cap. We'll see how that goes. Like the video if you like it. Subscribe if you want to see more information like this. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good weekend.